The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. Wars are not won in the moments history remembers. They are won in the ones nobody sees. A split-second decision, a hand reaching for something it has no right to take, a girl on her knees beside the wounded who looks up and decides that the story isn't over yet. The person the world hinges on never looks the part. That's the only reason it works. In the spring that the last battle was fought, in the smoldering ruin of a castle that had stood for 1,000 years, in the first gray light of a morning nobody was certain would come, the hinge of the wizarding world's history was a young woman kneeling beside a wounded Ravenclaw prefect, with a bottle of Dittany in her hand, and a mind running two calculations at the same time. One calculation was practical: severity of wound, resource allocation, probability of survival without further intervention. The other calculation she had been refusing to finish, since the boy she loved most in the world had said goodbye to her without saying goodbye, and walked into the dark. Her name was Hermione Granger. She was 19 years old. She was the brightest witch of her age, which is not the same as being the most powerful, though she would eventually become that too. She had grown up between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, finding her truest home in libraries and in the company of two boys who had taught her, without intending to, that love was not a weakness, but the sharpest tool available. One of those boys was dead. This is the story of what she did about it. It is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable one. It is the story of a mind that refused to accept a conclusion the universe had already drawn, and of the specific, enormous cost of that refusal. It is also, because no person exists in isolation, and because the history that followed was made by many hands, even if one pair carried more than their share. The story of a former prisoner who returned from death with energy to burn. A gentle man who found himself finally and completely himself. A loyal boy who became something formidable, while nobody was watching. A grieving twin who kept his shop open, because his brother would have wanted it. A young woman who learned to carry both her loss and her love, without letting either one destroy the other. And a gnarled institution of gold and ancient grievance that had been waiting several centuries for someone to understand them well enough to be useful. It begins in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, in the last hour before dawn, in the spring that changed everything. It ends on a railway platform, on a morning in September, 19 years later, when an ordinary woman in good robes took her husband's hand and walked through a barrier of enchanted brick into the familiar chaos of another generation leaving home. Between those two moments, 11 notebooks, 3 magical objects, 2 men returned from death, 1 constitutional framework, 1 goblin accord, 1 potions formula never completed by its creator, a spring equinox ritual conducted by a woman who had given up the ability to perform magic in order to return magic to the world, and a single variable she had spent 5 years being correctly patient about. Begin. The great hall in the aftermath of battles smelled of blood and burned stone, and the sharp sweetness of Dittany being applied too fast to too many wounds at once. Hermione moved between casualties with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that grief was a problem she would solve later, after she had solved the more immediate problems in front of her. The Ravenclaw prefect, she knew the girl's face and not her name, which she filed under things to correct, would survive. The boy in the corner with the shredded leg would not survive without intervention beyond what Dittany could provide. The elderly witch near the main doors had already passed the point where either of them could have helped. She moved to the boy with the leg. Ron was somewhere to her left. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him. By the specific quality of his presence, the sound of his breathing in a large space, the way he moved when he was trying to be useful without getting in the way of someone who knew more. He was crouched beside a Hufflepuff 7th year, doing something practical with a strip of torn robe and a stabilizing charm he had learned in the last year of running. His hands were shaking. She noticed this and did not mention it. Her hands were not shaking because she had made her hands into instruments rather than extensions of her feelings, and she was maintaining that decision through active effort. The calculation she had been refusing to finish had been running since the tent. Since the moment, weeks ago, months ago, time was unreliable. When she had read Harry's face in firelight and understood that he had reached a conclusion about himself that she could not argue him out of, and had not tried to. She had not tried to argue him out of it, because she was a person who understood sacrifice at the theoretical level, and because she had trusted, in the particular way she trusted him, that he was right. She had been wrong to trust this, or rather, she had been right about the sacrifice and wrong about the conclusion. Harry had been correct that he needed to die. He had been incorrect. She was now deciding that dead was where he needed to stay. She set the Dittany bottle down with careful hands and stood up. From somewhere beyond Hogwarts walls, transmitted through stone that had absorbed decades of voices and grief and learning, and was doing what it always did with the things entrusted to it, came Hagrid's voice. She had heard Hagrid grieve before. She had heard him at Dumbledore's funeral, the enormous, helpless sound of a man whose scale of love had always exceeded the world's capacity to accommodate it safely. She had heard him grieve small creatures that trusted him. But this sound carried across the castle's skin, to find her specifically, was in a register she had never heard, and immediately understood. This was the grief of someone carrying something that could not be set down. She was moving before she decided to move. The courtyard received her. The pre-dawn light was the color of something not yet committed to being a day. And Hagrid came out of the forest path with Harry in his arms, and the arms hung with the specific, absolute quality of a body that had finished with itself, and every part of Hermione that had been a child who read too many books about the world, finished in that moment. She completed the calculation. It produced, Harry Potter is dead. It also produced, simultaneously without pause, because her mind had always run parallel tracks, and this was simply the track that mattered most. A question. Not why. She understood why, not whether it could have been different. That was retrospective and useless. The question her mind produced, in the 3 seconds it took Hagrid to cross the courtyard toward Voldemort's spreading arms, was this. Is dead the same as gone? She had read enough to know that these were not always the same thing. Around her, the tableau assembled. Voldemort performed triumph the way he performed everything, as if the size of the gesture could retroactively justify the size of the cost. Neville Longbottom, at the edge of her peripheral vision, was struggling upright. She could see it before others could. The body bind wearing thin at its edges, Neville's face contorted with the specific effort of a person whose will had simply refused to accept what his body had been told. The sorting hat had rolled from his head during the bind. His hand was reaching for it. His hand was barely his yet. It was shaking with the effort of a person reclaiming themselves from the inside. She had 63 seconds, possibly fewer. She used the first 10 to look at what she would need and confirm where it was. The Elder Wand, in Voldemort's right hand, his grip loose because triumph does not hold things tightly, because certainty is its own form of vulnerability. She used the next 15 to understand the wand mastery chain. She was very good at this, running the logic fast, without sentiment. In the autumn before the battle was fought, Harry had been captured by Snatchers and taken to Malfoy Manor. In the chaos of the escape from that place, Harry had physically overwhelmed and disarmed Draco Malfoy. Wand mastery transferred through genuine conquest, through the act of winning, of overpowering, of demonstrating that you were the stronger will. Harry had won that moment. The Elder Wand's true mastery had passed to Harry at Malfoy Manor, months before tonight. Harry had then walked into the Forbidden Forest and died. The question was, what did death do to mastery? She had perhaps 4 seconds to answer this question, and she answered it from first principles. If mastery transferred through conquest, through being beaten, through will submitting to a stronger will, then death by willing sacrifice was not conquest. Harry had not been defeated. He had chosen. A soul that chose its own surrender had surrendered to nothing, conquered by no one. Voldemort had pointed a wand at a boy who had already decided, and the wand that answered that boy's mastery did not recognize the act as a transfer of anything. Voldemort did not hold the Elder Wand's mastery. He held its wooden core. Hermione was the person who was about to take it from him. The remaining seconds she spent on the logistics. The cloak was on Harry's body. She crossed the courtyard with the specific invisibility of a person who has learned that people do not see what they are not directed to see, and she found Harry in Hagrid's arms. And she touched Harry's face with one hand. She would not remember doing this, though she did it, and she took the cloak with the other. The cloak went over her shoulders. She was nothing. She was the absence of a person. She had spent her entire life being too much, too loud, too certain, too present, and now she was finally perfectly invisible. And she used that invisibility to reach through 6 feet of inattentive air and take the Elder Wand from a man who had never truly owned it. No spell, no arc of light. The wand moved from his loosening fingers to her sleeve, with the clean cooperation of an object returning to where it had decided it belonged. She was already at the forest's edge when Neville's hand closed around the sorting hat and the sword sang out of it into the morning air. She did not look back. Neville would succeed. He always succeeded at the things that needed to be done at the specific cost only he could pay. She trusted this completely. She entered the trees. The forbidden forest received her without judgment. Old things rarely judge. She found the resurrection stone in 38 paces from the path's edge. She did not need Harry's account of where he had stopped. She had no such account and would not pretend otherwise. What she had was the knowledge of Harry himself, the way he moved through spaces, the specific emotional geography of a person who chose privacy not because he was secretive, but because he handled the largest things alone, to protect others from carrying them. She knew where a person who had walked into a forest to die would have stopped, far enough from the castle to feel free of it. Not so far that the walk would have felt like drama, a place where the path bent slightly, where the trees thickened enough to feel held. She was right within the first attempt. She picked the stone up from the leaf litter and held it in her palm. Cold, small, entirely ordinary. She did not turn it. Not here, not yet. She moved deeper into the trees, until the sounds of the courtyard, the shouts, then the singing, then the weeping that followed the victory, became genuinely inaudible. She found a space between two ancient oaks, sat with her back against the wider trunk, and opened her arithmancy notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Problem: Harry Potter is dead. Solution required. Timeline: unspecified but finite. Begin." Below these 4 lines, she wrote everything she knew, in the smallest handwriting she possessed. The camp took the first week to build properly, because she built everything properly. 7 iterations of overlapping concealment charms, each tested against the detection methodology she had learned across a year of being hunted. The 7th version was undetectable by any ministry scanning protocol she knew. She built an 8th anyway, one that suppressed her magical signature rather than concealing its presence, so that any detection instrument aimed at this section of forest would read not concealed, but simply empty. Empty was better. Empty implied there was nothing to find. Concealed implied something was hiding. She had the Elder Wand for the refinement work. The Elder Wand was not what she had expected. She had expected brute amplification. More power, larger spells, the blunt force of extraordinary talent multiplied into something overwhelming. What she found instead was precision. The wand did not enlarge the scale of what she intended. It shortened the distance between intention and outcome. The concealment charms she cast with it were not more powerful. They were more accurate. They did exactly what she meant, with no slippage, no approximation, no rounding of corners. She wrote 3 pages of observations about this in the notebook and marked them critical, return. The stone she studied through a combination of the texts she had carried with her, the copy of the Tales of Beetle the Bard, the pages she had torn from various books and held in memory, and through conversation. First, her own mind, which was encyclopedic on the subject of magical theory. Then, cautiously through the stone itself. She did not turn it immediately. She spent the first month building the theoretical framework that would make turning it useful rather than merely grief-indulgent. She catalogued everything she had read about the veil. She reconstructed the arithmetic principles of soul frequency, a field so theoretical that it existed only in footnotes and speculation. She developed what she called, in the private shorthand of her notebooks, the anima vinculum, the soul bond mathematics, across 12 initial variable categories. Variable 4 she circled and left aside for 3 weeks before she wrote about it directly. Then she wrote, "The bond between Harry's soul and my own vibrates at a matched frequency. 7 years of shared near-death, shared purpose, and shared grief have created something the mathematics calls resonance entanglement. His soul and my soul are tuned to each other the way 2 strings tuned to the same note vibrate in sympathy when one is struck. I can find him because I am already calibrated to exactly his frequency. I have been for some time. No further annotation is required. This is sufficient." She marked the entry variable 4 and did not write about it again. She calculated it extensively. That was different. Firenze came in late spring, alone, stepping out of the tree shadow one morning, when the light made everything look provisional. He was the only centaur who had consistently treated her as an individual rather than a category. And he looked at her camp, the 5 open notebooks, the stone on its piece of bark, the elder wand beside it, with an expression she had learned to read as centaur for recognition. "You are attempting something that has not been attempted before," he said. "I know." He looked at the stone for a long time. Above them, through the canopy, the constellations he spent his life reading were invisible in daylight, but he looked toward them anyway. "The stars do not confirm that you will succeed." "The stars," she said, without particular heat, "are not running these calculations." He left without responding, which she had learned was the centaur equivalent of a nod. 3 days later, the first offering appeared at the camp's edge, a bundle of herbs with preservation properties she had already been planning to source, fresher than anything available to her. She added them to her supplies and wrote nothing about it in the notebook. Some acts of acknowledgement between intelligent beings require no documentation. She began with myrtle, not because myrtle was the most informative source available, but because myrtle was the most accessible, a ghost who had spent decades in the particular purgatory of the in-between, neither fully committed to the living world, nor having passed through to whatever followed it. She haunted the same bathroom where a basilisk had killed her when she was a student, and she had been there so long that she had become, without intending to, an expert on the texture of thresholds. The call was simple. The stone turned 3 times, the elder wand powering the channel at carefully calculated depth. Myrtle arrived in a rush of feeling, which was how Myrtle arrived at everything, and talked for 4 hours. Hermione wrote everything. What ghosts understood about the veil. It was not a wall. It was not a void. It was a current, a dimensional flow that carried what passed through it, not destroyed it, not held it fixed, but moved it the way a river moves something placed into it. The speed and distance of that movement varied. A soul that passed through warm, volitionally with intention, not torn away but stepping through, would move differently than one that was ripped through by violence. Myrtle used the word buoyant and then seemed surprised by her own word, and said it again as confirmation. "A soul that went in warm," she said, "stays warm. Warm things float." He would be near the surface. Hermione wrote, "Soul warmth as a determinant of veil proximity. Pursue." Nearly headless Nick was the second source, and the more valuable one for reasons she had not initially anticipated. Nick had stood at the threshold and stepped back, had chosen the half-life of a ghost over the commitment of whatever lay beyond. Because, as he told her with the melancholy specificity of someone who had spent centuries with the decision, he had been afraid. This should have made him useless. It made him invaluable. Because Nick could describe, with the phenomenological precision of someone who had nearly done something and hadn't, exactly what the threshold felt like from the outside. Not darkness, he said. She had expected darkness. What he described was light, the kind without a name, the kind that was somehow both familiar and strange simultaneously, the way light in a dream of a room you loved is both the room and its memory at once. He described an aperture, not a wall. He described the feeling of a current. He described the specific quality of what was on the other side, not absence, not nothingness, but presence of a different kind, organized differently, following rules different from the rules of the living world. She wrote until she ran out of parchment on that sheet and began the next. The third source found her. She was testing the stone's range at extended elder wand amplification, a technical exercise, the stone as instrument rather than as door, when a soul came without being summoned. It arrived at the edges of the channel she had opened, drawn by the signal's depth, close enough to the threshold to respond without requiring specific invitation. The soul introduced herself carefully, in the measured cadence of someone accustomed to precision. She had been an unspeakable from her early 40s until her mid-50s, specializing in what the department had classified as veil proximity research. She had died of natural causes in her late 50s, and she had been near the threshold since, in the veil's antechamber, a region she described as existing outside time in the conventional sense, where duration was simultaneously finite and infinite depending on how you attempted to measure it. "I've been waiting," she told Hermione, "for someone to open this channel correctly." Hermione said, "Tell me everything about the veil's dimensional structure." "I have parchment." The former unspeakable, she gave Hermione her name, Penelope Marsh, with the specificity of someone who had not said their own name in a long time and wanted it on the record, talked across 3 sessions totaling 11 hours. At the end of the 3rd session, she gave Hermione the thing she had been building toward without knowing it, a phenomenological map of the veil's interior, translated through 6 hours of mathematical dialogue into arithmetic notation that could be calculated, triangulated, worked with. Hermione laid this map over her 7-variable framework. They fit together with the specific, unambiguous engagement of a correct key in a specific lock. Not approximately, not with adjustment, exactly. The third session with Penelope Marsh ran the longest and produced the most. Hermione had arrived at it with 17 pages of preparatory questions, organized by dimensional subcategory, and she worked through them in sequence over 4 hours, while Marsh answered with the methodical pleasure of someone who has spent a very long time in possession of information and no means of conveying it. What the antechamber felt like from the inside, not cold, which people assumed, but dimensionally dense, the way deep water is dense, a pressure that came from all directions simultaneously, not painful but unmistakable. Time moved in layers rather than linearly, each layer a different rate, so that a moment could be simultaneously very long and very brief depending on which layer of awareness you inhabited. Marsh had found, over the long duration of her antechamber existence, that she could choose her layer of awareness deliberately, which was a skill she had developed and which she described with the professional satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem with no prior documentation. What souls near the threshold felt, the pull of the current she had described, the awareness of the living world as a quality of light, not visible light, but a kind of warmth radiation that permitted orientation, the way you can feel a fire's direction without seeing it. Intentional souls, volitional souls, souls that had gone through warm. They could orient toward this warmth. They could remain near it rather than drifting with the current. The one you are looking for, Marsh said, during the final session, has been oriented toward a specific warmth for the entire duration of his time here. I cannot identify which warmth specifically, because that level of discrimination is beyond what I can read from the antechamber. But I can tell you that a soul which remains oriented toward the living world for years is a soul that has something there it has not finished with. Hermione wrote this down. She underlined it. She wrote in the margin, "He is staying near the surface on purpose. He is not drifting. He is waiting." She wrote, in the smallest handwriting she used, "He is there. I can see him in the mathematical sense. He is exactly where I calculated. He is aware. I believe he can sense me working." Below that, pressing so hard the parchment slightly tore. "I'm coming." In the first autumn under the regime's full control, she emerged from the forest for the first time with a purpose beyond survival. She had spent the intervening months refining not only her theoretical framework, but also her practical capabilities. The ancient sorcery, pre-wand techniques derived from texts she had sourced through stone communion with practitioners who had died before wands were standardized, operated through life force directly rather than through an instrument. It was harder to learn than anything she had done before, and easier to master than anything she had done before, because it had no mediation layer between intention and effect, and she had always been better at intention than at technique. She built her first identity cache. She acquired papers. She learned the shape of the new ministry's surveillance architecture and mapped its gaps the way she had always mapped things she needed to navigate, completely, from multiple angles, with particular attention to what was missing. The legal research took 3 weeks in the forest by wandlight. She worked through 7 texts, 2 volumes of pre-ministry wizarding inheritance law, a goblin-authored history of blood logic doctrine translated into English near the end of the previous century by a long-dead unspeakable. Dumbledore's own annotated copy of Magical Law, Ancient and Modern, which she had retrieved from his office during a careful incursion into the sealed school, and 3 documents she drafted herself, legal arguments constructed with the same load-bearing architecture she brought to arithmetic proofs. The law, she found, was full of gaps. It had always been full of gaps. The gap between what a statute said and what it was designed to prevent was where argument lived, and she had never met a gap she couldn't inhabit. She arrived at Gringotts on a morning in early winter, through the public entrance, without the cloak. This decision had been examined from every angle for 3 days. The cloak would communicate that she was hiding. She was not hiding. She was conducting legitimate business under her own name, using legitimate legal instruments, and arriving invisible would communicate precisely the wrong thing to an institution she needed to trust her. Goblins, she had read, respected directness with a specificity that bordered on the sacred. Indirectness was not merely impolite in goblin professional culture. It was a form of fraud. She wore her best robes and carried the Elder Wand visibly in her right hand. Not as a threat, as an honesty. Any senior goblin would read the wand's provenance immediately. Concealing it would be a deception. She had no interest in deceiving Gringotts. The lobby stopped when she entered. Not dramatically, with the professional recalibration of an institution encountering a variable it had been tracking and now had to account for in real time. She watched it happen across 20-some goblin faces in the seconds it took her to cross to the nearest teller. They were reading the wand. They were reading her magical signature. They were reading the briefcase. The teller, young by goblin standards, looked at the wand, looked at her face, and picked up an internal communication device without being asked. Director Ragnar's office occupied the building's third level. The room had the quality of a workspace that had been used seriously for a very long time. Old ironwood desk, shelves of working ledgers worn at the spines from regular consultation, no chairs for visitors. She stood. Ragnar entered from a side door. He had the quality of something that had been accumulating authority for a very long time, and had stopped needing to perform it. He looked at her with amber eyes performing the same assessment the lobby goblins had performed, but at greater depth. "Madam Granger," he said. His English was the English of a professional instrument. "Director Ragnar. Thank you for the prompt response." He sat. He did not offer her a chair. She remained standing without mentioning this. "You've sent a one-page letter requesting a meeting about the Lestrange and Black Vault holdings. The letter does not specify the legal basis for your claim. This is either an oversight or a demonstration that you consider the legal basis self-evident. The latter," she said. "Proceed." She opened the briefcase and presented the arguments in the order of their logical dependency. The Lestrange claim first. Blood logic doctrine, ancient and never formally repealed, occupying the legislative gap that formed when modern inheritance law superseded but did not expressly extinguish it. There was no eligible claimant for the Lestrange estate under modern statutes. Bellatrix Lestrange had no direct heirs. Rodolphus's line was documented as ended. The estate had been in technical intestacy. Blood logic filled the gap, and Blood logic's provisions for magical conquest were documented in 3 sources she laid on the desk, the goblin-authored one, carrying particular weight in this room. She placed the Elder Wand beside the documentation, briefly, long enough for Ragnar to read it. "The Elder Wand's documented mastery history is extensive," she said. "Draco Malfoy disarmed Albus Dumbledore at the end of the previous school year, passing mastery through the established conquest sequence. Harry Potter overpowered and disarmed Draco Malfoy during the escape from this estate's counterpart several months before the final battle, transferring mastery to himself. Harry Potter's death in the forest on the night of the battle was a volitional sacrifice, a willing surrender to nothing, an act of choosing rather than of being conquered. The mastery did not cleanly transfer through an act that was not genuine conquest. The entity who subsequently possessed the wand's wood was never its true master, and the wand's behavior in his hands confirmed this. When I took the wand from him in the courtyard chaos, I did not take it from its master. I took it from someone holding property that had become, in the ambiguity of mastery law, ownerless. And the wand responded to me." She picked it up again. "It has continued to respond to me. The wand itself is confirmation. Blood logic recognizes this." Ragnar examined the first 5 pages of her arithmetic proof of soul resonance, entanglement. Variable 4, with the attention of someone reading at professional level. He was quiet for 6 minutes. She stood in the silence and did not fill it. "You understand," he said, "that accepting these claims would make you the single largest private holder of wizarding assets in Britain?" "Yes. And that the ministry will object." She looked at him with the expression she had been developing for moments, requiring precision rather than warmth. "The ministry," she said, "will not be in a position to object for much longer. I would suggest that Gringotts begin preparing for a transition." 13 seconds of silence. She counted them. "We have been waiting," Ragnar said. "At 14, for someone to say that with sufficient documentation to support it." He opened a drawer, produced a standard account transfer form, modified it with several notations in his own language, and slid it across the desk. "The accounts will be transferred. Vault access will be granted. Gringotts will additionally provide a formal certification of your legal standing, which you will find useful for subsequent proceedings." She signed with the quill she always carried, the one she had used since her 4th year when she had developed the preference for this particular instrument that serious students eventually developed. Madame Granger, Ragnok said, and she noted the shift from her surname to a title. Gringotts has grievances of its own against the current regime. We have been waiting for a patron with the intelligence to understand them. I understand them, she said. I've read your institutional history. I know what was taken, and when, and by whom. She closed the briefcase. When a Regency Council is established, Gringotts will be invited to negotiate the first genuine Goblin-Wizard Accord in 3 centuries. I would ask for your patience until then. Goblins, Ragnok said, are accustomed to patience. She descended to the main floor with 2 vault keys in her pocket, and a certification document in the briefcase, and the particular quality of someone who has completed an argument successfully and is already thinking about the next one. Lucius Malfoy was in the lobby. She identified him at 30 feet, the posture of a man performing dignity that was no longer fully supported by circumstance, the careful quality of expensive robes on someone who had been managing resources rather than replenishing them. He had been diminished under the regime whose rise he had enabled, stripped of influence by a master who did not reward failure, rendered increasingly irrelevant by his own mishandled loyalty. He turned from the teller's window and processed her arrival in sequence. First the face, which he knew from years of watching her occupy a castle he had tried to use as an instrument of his own politics. Then the robes. Then the briefcase. Then the elder wand, which she had not concealed, which she carried in her right hand, as she had throughout. She watched him arrive at the end of his processing sequence and find nothing there that he could accommodate. This was the man who had, during Hermione's second year at Hogwarts, slipped a diary containing a piece of someone else's soul into Ginny Weasley's cauldron, at a bookshop, concealed among her school things like a gift that was actually an erasure, and called it charity. This was the man whose pen and influence and institutional standing had helped build the apparatus now consuming the world. He was after. He was definitively, permanently after. She walked past him without speaking, without slowing her pace, without turning her head. She walked through the bronze doors of Gringotts into a winter morning, and behind her, Lucius Malfoy stood frozen in the lobby for 20 minutes. And the goblins watched him with the attentive patience of an institution that had just decided which side of history it was on. See, Plala, she chose Corbin Yaxley third. Her first and second candidates had been eliminated through analysis. The first was too symbolic, which would reframe the work as revenge narrative rather than operational dismantling. The second had already become irrelevant without her assistance. Yaxley was the correct choice. Former head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, architect of the Muggle-born Registration Commission's administrative infrastructure, and its subsequent, uglier evolution under full regime control. A man who had signed documents rather than cast spells, and whose distance from the direct consequences of his decisions was precisely where he kept his conscience comfortable. She had documented 43 deaths attributable to his pen. She spent 6 weeks watching him. Not continuously. The calculations did not pause, the notebooks accumulated, but on a regular schedule, from various positions in the surrounding streets, invisible under the cloak, reading his magical signature through the passive field sense she had been developing. 43 times she had read him arrive at the same table in the same back room of the leaky cauldron. The same 2-guard formation, the same routing. She knew his formation's blind spots with the precision of 6 weeks of observation. The message she intended to send was not addressed to Voldemort. It was addressed to the administrative tier, the men and women who had concluded that their institutional competence was armor. The message was simple. Your competence is not armor. She dressed correctly, not dramatically, correctly. The robes of a ministry professional in the pre-regime period, nothing that announced her, nothing that suggested a performance. She wanted the witnesses to remember a woman in robes, not a figure. She was not performing. She arrived in the back room before him. She ordered tea. She opened a notebook and read it with the attention of someone for whom this was routine. When Yaxley arrived with his guards and took the corner table, she did not rise immediately. She finished her tea. Unhurried action in operational settings was the single most effective concealment available. Nothing reads as less threatening than someone taking their time. Then she moved. She was behind Yaxley's chair in the gap of his senior guard's sightline, before either guard completed a rotation cycle. She placed her hands on both guards simultaneously. The ancient sorcery, direct, precise, 2 applications lasting less than 2 seconds. The guards went horizontal in the specific unhurried way of bodies that had decided to sleep very thoroughly. The room, as she had known it would, did not register this. 8 patrons in a back room, and 2 men going quietly unconscious, contained within 2 seconds in the visual dead zone she had identified over 6 weeks of observation. Yaxley began to rise, her hand closed around his wrist. "Sit down." He sat. Not because she commanded it, because the contact she had established through his wrist had reached the outer layer of his magical signature, and was conveying to it the specific information of encountering something significantly more powerful than itself. And his body understood this before his mind could argue. 43, she said. She watched him calculate what that meant. She told him. She recited every name in the order she had learned them, which was the order they had died, and the recitation took 4 minutes, and he did not speak during any of it. Then she said, "Do you know all of them?" She already knew the answer. His magical signature's surface was showing her the specific absence of 43 individual registrations. He had signed volume. He had not registered names. She entered his magical core through the contact point. What she extracted, the architectural interface between his intention and magical effect, the practitioner's specific capacity to channel power, left him sitting in his chair, with neat gray hair, and the hollow expression of a man who has just discovered that the part of himself he has never once questioned is missing. He understood what had happened. She had ensured that he would understand it. She had decided, 2 weeks before this evening, that clarity was the gift she was offering him, not mercy. Clarity, the 43 names, and the knowledge that someone had counted them, and the knowledge that each one had cost him this. Before she left, she turned to the bar. An old witch had been sitting there throughout, nursing something amber, looking at the middle distance with the particular focus of someone who had spent years making themselves invisible in public spaces because visibility under this regime was a risk. Hermione met her eyes. She held the contact for 3 seconds. She let her face do nothing, not reassurance, not threat, not the performance of significance. She simply looked, the way one person looks at another when they want to communicate. "I see you. You are real." This happened. The old witch looked back. Her hands were very still around her glass. Hermione walked out through the leaky cauldron's front door into the street. The report reached Voldemort within 2 days. It traveled up through the Death Eater medical hierarchy, losing specificity at each level of transmission, until what arrived at his desk was a single sentence. "Whatever she used, it doesn't exist in any text we have." He read it twice. He set it down. He sat in silence for a long time. He had won the war entirely and thoroughly. He knew this. He also knew that the sentence in front of him had been generated by a 22-year-old witch, who should not have been a variable, because the war's outcome was supposed to have resolved all variables. He did not share the report with his lieutenants. He began a private file. He did not yet have a name for it. 3 weeks later, an enchanted coin in a network Hermione had begun building through Neville's surviving DA connections, lit up with a message. It read simply, 3 years of your list. Working through it. Don't stop. H. The old witch from the bar read it in the particular way of someone who had been waiting for confirmation of a thing they had half believed. She folded the message carefully. She put it in her pocket. She took it out twice more before morning. Ron Weasley had been looking for her for 2 years. Not continuously. He had his own grief to manage. Fred's death at the battle had split the Weasley family in a way that no magic could repair, though George had tried everything available to him, including humor, which did not work, and working, which helped a little. Ron had joined the underground resistance that grew in the battle's aftermath, a ragged, determined network of survivors operating through Neville's coin system and Kingsley Shacklebolt's communications from international exile. He had done good work. He was better at operational thinking than he gave himself credit for, which was a pattern she had observed since their first year. He found her in the spring of the second year, when she allowed herself to be found. A coin message through Neville's network. "I know you're somewhere. I know you're working. Tell me what to do." She sent back 3 words. Trust the network. He understood this. He was one of the few people who might have. Ron's understanding of trust was not intellectual. It was constitutional, built into him by years of being the person who showed up and kept showing up. He trusted the network. He kept working inside it. He sent her information when he had it, and did not demand more than she could give. This was, she noted in the margin of the working notebook, a form of love she had never found adequately documented. Ginny Weasley carried Harry's death differently. She carried it the way someone carries the first wound that changes the shape of everything after. Not as a scar, exactly, but as a new dimension of her own architecture. She had been 17 when he walked into the forest. She became something harder and quieter in the years that followed, flying for Holyhead, playing her anger into the broomsmanship that made her one of the finest chasers of her generation. She did not talk about Harry often. When she did, it was with the specific economy of someone who has decided that precision is a way of honoring something rather than containing it. She did not know about Hermione's work. None of them did, not fully. This was a choice Hermione had made deliberately. Telling people would mean supporting their hope, and supporting hope she could not yet guarantee would have been a cruelty she was unwilling to add to the ledger. The spring equinox of the second year after the battle was the night she first called through the channel, with the consent protocol built in. She sat in the death chamber. She had made her first visit 3 months prior, mapping the space, measuring the veil's permeability cycle, establishing the temporal patterns she needed, and she powered the resurrection stone to the depth she had calculated for the location of the first soul she intended to reach. Not Harry. Not yet. First, Sirius. She had written him a letter. It had no delivery mechanism. She burned it anyway, because writing it was a form of the conversation she could not yet have. Dear Sirius, I am trying to bring Harry back. I need your help. What I am offering is not life and not death. It is something that has not existed before. You would exist between, in a form that is stable and real and not suffering. You could make choices. You could move. You could... And she had paused here for a long time before writing it. Be here for him when he arrives. She burned the letter and returned to work. The consent transmission was designed not as language but a soul frequency pattern, the full shape of the offer, encoded in mathematics that any soul at the veil's inner threshold could read in its own register. It carried the critical information: this is what is being offered. This is what it will cost. Either answer is complete. She would not ask again if the answer was no. She powered the stone and transmitted the offer. 15 seconds. The stone warmed in a single breath, from ambient temperature to something close to body heat, and the warming carried a rhythm that her framework read as intentional response. Yes, it translated, in the imprecise but recognizable language of soul frequency mathematics, and, what took you so long? She adjusted the coordinates to Remus's position, deeper in the veil's structure, and transmitted the same offer. 30 seconds. Then a response that was different in character, quieter, more considered, the frequency pattern of someone who had thought about it before answering, yes, I'll come. She powered the stone to maximum. The veil tore along a 6-inch seam at the archway's left edge. She had prepared for drama and found instead something more moving. The tear opened the way a seam opens when the threads on both sides have been carefully, deliberately loosened from opposite directions. The veil had been worked on from the inside. They had been coming toward it from their side while she had been working from hers. The light that came through was the light Nick had described. She understood him now, familiar and strange simultaneously, the quality of light in the memory of a room you loved, which is both the room and the memory at the same time. Sirius came through first. The emergence was loud and bright and slightly chaotic, a significant amount of contained energy finding an exit. He took form over 90 seconds. First, a quality of presence that she felt through the frequency sense rather than saw, then outline, then substance, then the specific consolidated realness of Sirius Black mid-laugh, mid-combat, caught in the expression of a man doing exactly what he wanted to be doing in the moment he stopped, and that expression fading as his consciousness fully integrated with the new form, into something that saw the death chamber and the notebooks and the elder wand in her hand and understood, in rapid sequence, what had happened and who was responsible. His eyes found her. Remus came through 30 seconds later, quieter. He took form in 60 seconds, stood, and closed his eyes. He stood with his eyes closed for a long time. She understood, from the research, what he was experiencing. The lycanthropy, 36 years of dual resonance in his soul frequency, human and wolf inseparable, the curse that had defined every decision he had ever made about what he was allowed to have, was gone. The liminal state was not the living world, and the curse was a living world condition, and without its host, the dual resonance had resolved into one. He was entirely himself. She had known this would happen, and had wondered what it would mean to him, and now she was watching him discover it, and she did not have mathematics for this. Sirius crossed to Remus in 2 steps and grabbed his arms with both hands, checking the solidity of him with the thoroughness of someone who had been separated from something precious and needed to verify its return. Mooney. Remus opened his eyes. He checked Sirius with equal thoroughness. Then they both looked at her. She waited. Sirius's voice was exactly what 3 years of other people's descriptions had built for it in her head. The voice of a man who had been pacing somewhere for years and had finally been given something useful to do with the energy. "Where's Harry?" "Sit down," she said. "This will take a while." She told them everything. It took 3 hours. They sat in the death chamber, she cross-legged on the floor, Sirius pacing the chamber's perimeter in the pattern of someone who needs to move while processing. Remus seated against the wall with the receiving quality she remembered from the year he had been their professor. Deep reception, nothing on the surface. When she finished, Sirius put his head in his hands. She waited. After 2 minutes, he looked up. His face had done the thing it always did. Converted pain into forward motion, not because the pain was gone, but because he knew no other productive relationship with it. "What do you need from us?" he said. She produced the list. 6 pages of specific operational requirements, intelligence gathering, field coordination, Death Eater network infiltration, logistical support. She handed it to Sirius, who read it page by page with the focus of someone reading a tactical brief, passing each page to Remus as he finished. Remus reached the final page. He looked up. "You've planned for everything except one thing. Tell me. You haven't planned for what happens when Harry comes back and finds out what you've become." He said it without condemnation, with the quality she had always associated with him, the voice that made difficult things sound like information rather than verdict, not a criticism, an operational gap. "He's going to need time to understand everything that happened while he was gone. You'll need to be prepared to give him that time without interpreting it as rejection." She held his gaze for a long moment. She wrote in the margin of the nearest page, Variable 8, Harry's response, not yet calculable, prepare for uncertainty. She did not write an answer. She added it to the list of things to understand when she had the data. Neville Longbottom had spent 3 years growing into something formidable while everyone was looking elsewhere. He ran the coin network from inside Hogwarts during the regime's occupation of the school, coordinating messages between the underground resistance and Hermione's operations with the focused competence of someone who had learned, through years of being underestimated, through Neville's specific damage done to his confidence by people who should have known better, that he was capable of more than he had been allowed to believe. By the time Hermione needed an operative inside the Ministry the night before her administrative takeover, Neville had been doing this kind of work for 3 years, and he did it with the ease of long practice. He sealed the secondary flu network at first light. He sent the confirmation through the coin. Then he went home and slept for 12 hours, which she considered the appropriate response to having spent the previous night being very good at something terrifying. She entered the Ministry at 9 in the morning, through the public entrance. The detection wards were the most sophisticated in Britain. They did not register her. She had spent 4 days mapping the detection frequency range and 3 days developing a signature suppression technique that placed her precisely in the gap between ward layers, not invisible, which would register as absence, but so generic and ordinary that the wards filed her as administrative staff. She went to level 1. Pious Thickness was 63 years old and had been under the Imperious Curse since the year before the final battle, when the regime's architects had begun the groundwork for their ministry takeover. He had been in this office, signing whatever was placed in front of him, for over a year, but the person who had been Pious Thickness before the curse had been somewhere inside that, not absent, but inaccessible, present in the way that a man in a room with no windows is still a man. She crossed to his desk and told him what she was about to do, because that was the correct way to do it. "I'm going to remove the Imperious Curse. I need you to stay still. It requires concentration. Resisting will extend the duration and may cause damage." He stopped reaching for his wand. The curse's basic defensive protocol heard a voice of authority and deferred to it. She placed her hands on his temples and began. 5 years of Imperious had integrated into his magical signature, like scar tissue, not separate from the substrate but woven into it, indistinguishable in places from the architecture it had replaced. She found it through the life force reading, colder than the surrounding signature, with the cold of something that operates without generating its own warmth. She peeled it at its boundary layer by layer, with the precision of someone removing adhesive from a surface worth preserving. At the first minute, his hands began to shake. At the second minute, his breathing changed. deepened, became his own. At the third minute, she heard him say a name, barely audible. His wife's, she assumed. At the fourth minute, she withdrew her hands. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has just woken from a very long dream, and has not yet located the distance between where they were and where they are. His eyes were present, focused, his own. "My name is Hermione Granger," she said. "I'm going to explain the situation. Please listen carefully, because what I'm about to offer will not be offered twice." She explained in 7 minutes. She was efficient with exposition when efficiency was what the situation required. He signed the resignation document with a hand that was his own for the first time in years. She watched him read it, watched him process with his own comprehension what she was offering. Not a scapegoat's exit, but a genuine one. With dignity intact, with the imperious acknowledged as what it was. When he signed, he looked at her and said quietly, "What are you?" She considered the question. "Someone who counted," she said, and left. The all-staff communication went through the ministry's own broadcast system, a back channel the regime's security architecture had overlooked because it predated their control by 30 years. Her voice reached every office and corridor simultaneously. She stated the minister had resigned. A Regency Council was being established. Level 1 personnel above a specific clearance were asked to report to the atrium. Personnel with pending investigative referrals were asked to remain in their offices. And at the end, in the same voice, "If you have been waiting for this, you no longer need to wait. Come down." The atrium filled in 20 minutes. She stood at its center, not on an elevated platform but on the floor, where anyone who entered was at her level. She watched them arrive. The Category 3 people first, the ones who had been doing the minimum required to survive, keeping heads below a parapet they had not built, and now looking at her with the expression of people who are trying to determine if an exhale they have been holding for 3 years is finally safe to complete. 22 of the regime's genuine believers attempted to exit through the sealed secondary flue network. They found it sealed. 9 Regency field operatives, who had been in position since before she entered the building, collected them efficiently and without drama. She addressed the atrium for 19 minutes. She was precise and she was not unkind. She explained the Regency Council, its structure, its constitutional basis, its explicitly temporary duration. Interim, she said, specifically and repeatedly, because she was not building a permanent power structure, and the people in this room needed to understand the difference. At the end, she said, "If you choose to remain, you are choosing to participate in building something different. I will not pretend that building something different is easy. I will tell you that it is possible, because I have been doing it for 3 years from a camp in the Forbidden Forest. And if one person can do it alone in a forest, then 460 people can do it in a functioning institution." 3 days later, Dolores Umbridge arrived at the Regency Council's first tribunal. She arrived with the confidence of a woman who had spent 40 years wielding institutional authority as a personal weapon and had never met a room she could not maneuver within. She sat in the tribunal chair, designed by Hermione at floor level, not lowered below the panel, because she had redesigned the chamber specifically to eliminate the below judges arrangement that the old Wizengamot used. With the expression of someone who believed she was the most powerful person present, Hermione placed the first memory vial on the table between them. One of 63, representing 63 testimonies from Muggle-born witches and wizards, processed through Umbridge's administrative division, each one reconstructed using legilimency and arithmetic memory techniques. 63 vials occupied approximately 4 feet of the tribunal table. They caught the overhead light and threw small prismatic patterns across Umbridge's face. The first vial, Hermione said, contains the testimony of a Muggle-born witch named Kathleen Marrow, age 41. She appeared before the Muggle-born Registration Commission's administrative division in the first autumn of the regime's control. The case officer on that date was you. The file is case number 11847. I have the file. She placed the file beside the vials. Umbridge opened her mouth. "I'm going to stop you," Hermione said, without raising her voice, "before you tell me you don't know what I'm referring to. I know exactly what you're going to say, because you've said it in every bureaucratic proceeding you've participated in for 40 years. The vials contain the memories of people who were in the same room as you when you made decisions about their lives. They are not corroborating each other. They don't know each other. They are corroborating each other because the same person was in that room with all of them, and that person was you." Umbridge looked at the 63 vials. Her face stopped performing. Underneath the performance was an expression she had never had to show professionally, because she had never been in a professional setting where she was the one without the institutional advantage. She ran out of tools. Hermione watched this happen with the attention she brought to all significant data. She did not experience satisfaction, she experienced resolution, the specific quality of something completing that was always designed to complete. "We'll begin with the first vial," she said, and the tribunal proceeded. Kingsley Shacklebolt returned from international exile 3 months after the ministry takeover, summoned by a coin message from Neville that said simply, "She's done it. Come home." He arrived at the Regency Council's second full session and sat in the chair she had kept empty at the table's right end. And he listened to the entire 2-hour session with the attention of a man who has spent decades reading institutions and is now reading a new one very carefully. After the session, he found her in the corridor and said, "You know I'm going to want to stand for minister eventually." "I know." She said, "The electoral framework will be ready in 8 months. I'd recommend running in the first cycle." He looked at her steadily. "And you won't stand yourself?" "No." "Why?" She considered this honestly. "Because what I've built needs to outlast me. The moment it requires my presence to function, it has failed as architecture. You are what the architecture is designed to produce, someone who can run this without me." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You're 23 years old." "Yes," she said. "I'm aware. The Department of Mysteries had 6 security layers above the standard ministry architecture." She mapped them over 4 days, reading each layer's frequency through the passive sense from the corridor outside the unmarked door. The designers, she identified 3 individual magical signatures in the ward architecture, all unspeakable, all decades old, had built a security system that tested comprehension rather than power. This was, she found, the single most elegant thing the ministry had ever built. The first additional layer required identifying the ward's own structural flaw and exploiting it rather than overpowering it. The second required theoretical knowledge of soul-adjacent magical frequency, even to perceive, invisible to anyone without that knowledge, which meant anyone without it could not be stopped by it, because you cannot be stopped by a wall you can't see. The third was a logic system built in pre-Latin runes, the kind she had been learning from the oldest souls in her stone communion for 2 years. 6 hours to work through all 6 layers. At hour 5, she encountered the only moment that slowed her appreciably. A ward combining soul frequency detection with arithmetic pattern recognition in conjunction. 2 systems working together to create a test requiring both simultaneously. She sat in the corridor for 22 minutes and solved it entirely in her head before touching it, because touching it incorrectly would reset the sequence to the beginning. She did it correctly on the first attempt. The unmarked door opened. 3 unspeakable researchers were in the sub-basement when she descended. She had known they were there since they left their offices, having felt their signatures in her passive field. She had allowed them to find her because she had already assessed them as people who had spent years working in proximity to the Veil on fragments of the problem she had solved, and those were not people she intended to dismiss. Their names: Senior Researcher Vera Aldridge, who had spent a decade on Veil permeability cycles and had the posture of someone accustomed to the view from the edge of what was currently understood. Researcher Caius Pont, who had been working since the previous decade on soul trajectory mathematics, and was the one who sat down on the vault bench when he read the first 3 pages of her arithmetic framework. Junior researcher Delia Park, the youngest, who read her research assignment with the expression of someone encountering a question that reorganizes every previous question they have asked. 2 years, Hermione told them. "I'll be in contact through the Regency's research channel. Your work will be conducted under full academic freedom. I have no interest in directing your conclusions, only in receiving them." The Chronos loom, in the sub-basement's 3rd room, confirmed Harry's position in the Veil's dimensional structure precisely when she set the anima vinculum calculations into its reading interface. Precisely, not approximately, not within margin of error, but exactly. 2 independent systems built from different methodologies, arriving at the same coordinates, without deviation. This is what mathematical confirmation feels like. Not relief. She had not permitted herself the vulnerability of doubt that relief requires. Verification. The universe agrees. The Flamel notes, in the 5th room behind a potion's knowledge lock, gave her the elixir of return, as Flamel had conceived it and stopped. She could see exactly where he had stopped and why. The theoretical gap between sustaining existing life and providing a vessel for returning life was a bridge he had never needed to build. She built it in her mind while she read his notes, the arithmetic framework connecting the gap with the soul frequency mathematics she already possessed. The bridge existed. She saw it clearly. She was grateful. In the particular way she was grateful for things that mattered most. For 7 years of refusing to specialize, Nagini's magical signature entered her passive awareness 11 days before she was ready to act. Ancient, cold, carrying the dual resonance of a creature hosting a soul fragment that had become over 40 years of integration, load-bearing in the snake's own architecture. She had been watching the snake's movement patterns, its location within Malfoy Manor to within 4 meters at any given hour, for weeks. 4 meters was within range of the soul solvent technique. The operation was coordinated. Sirius and 9 Regency operatives, and 7 surviving Order members, Kingsley commanding the Order contingent, having returned from exile in time for this, moving through the Manor's perimeter ward system, mapped by Remus's intelligence network over 6 months, occupying the exterior guards and preventing reinforcement. She entered alone. The Manor's ward system recognized her as dangerous and attempted to compress. She unmade the compression ward's structural logic before it activated, dissolving it at its own foundation so that no compression occurred rather than resisting it after it had started. The ward did not fail dramatically. It simply stopped being a ward. 11 Death Eaters in the building's interior. Voldemort in the primary study on the 2nd floor. She identified his signature immediately, enormous and complex, carrying its own history of violence in every layer. Nagini in the East Wing corridor below, moving at the patient pace of a creature with nowhere specific to be. She found an empty room adjacent to the East Wing and entered it and closed the door. 3 minutes of sustained focus at 70% Elder Wand output. At minute 1, the Horcrux fragment in Nagini began to destabilize. At minute 2, the fragment was fully isolated from the snake's own signature. At minute 3, the soul solvent dispersed it completely. Nagini died without drama. Her signature simply stopped, the way a sound stops, cleanly. Above, on the 2nd floor, she felt Voldemort's signature change. She was in the study's doorway when he finished processing it. He turned from the window. He looked at the Elder Wand in her hand. She watched the comprehension arrive. A very intelligent mind, processing at speed. A sequence of information it had been refusing to process for months, because the conclusion was unacceptable. The wand's false mastery. The systematic dismantling of his administrative infrastructure. Nagini. All of it arriving simultaneously. "You took it," he said. "In the courtyard. In the chaos." "Yes," she said. He attacked. She had run this specific sequence 411 times in theoretical models. The deflection field she had built into her ambient magical architecture, ancient sorcery, passive, requiring nothing of her to maintain, redirected each curse as an input rather than resisting it as a force. 5 killing curses in 8 seconds. 5 dispersals he did not touch her. She watched him generate alternatives. He was brilliant. She had never underestimated this. Even now, even here, his mind was working. "You've had the Elder Wand for years," she said. "You've had years to wonder why it didn't work for you. I have an answer." She gave it to him because this was not a conversation for his benefit. It was a documentation of the record she was making in this room, of exactly how this was done and why. Draco Malfoy disarmed Dumbledore. This transferred mastery. Harry Potter physically overpowered and disarmed Draco during the escape from this very estate. Months before the final battle, this transferred mastery to Harry. Harry's death in the forest was a volitional sacrifice, a willing surrender to nothing, conquered by no one. Mastery does not transfer through an act that is not genuine conquest. A boy who chose death cannot be said to have been defeated by the man who killed him. The wand knew. When I took it from your grip in the courtyard, I took it from someone who had never held mastery over it, only over its wood. The wand responded to me because a wand without a living master will respond to whoever next demonstrates the stronger will. I demonstrated this. She paused. You lost the most important magical object in history to a disarming spell on someone standing next to the person you actually wanted, performed by a student who couldn't yet produce a corporeal Patronus when you first met her. This is why it never worked the way you expected. He raised his wand. She applied the soul solvent, not to a Horcrux, to Tom Riddle himself. Not the body, the architectural self. The accumulated decades of constructed identity, the deliberate dismantling of every human connection that might have prevented this, the choices laid on choices until the original person was entirely obscured. His magical core, sustained for 7 decades by a combination of extraordinary native power and Horcrux insurance, now had neither. The core dispersed. What remained, when she read his signature in its final moments, was something small and old, the residue of a person that had existed before the choices began. A boy in an orphanage who had been afraid and made fear into an architecture that eventually had no room for him inside it. She did not speak to that residue. There was nothing to say. His body, maintained for decades by magic now absent, began the process that unmaintained bodies begin. It took 6 minutes. He did not speak. His final expression was bewilderment, the specific bewilderment of someone who had built their entire identity on intellectual superiority and who arrived at their final moment understanding that the witch who had dismantled everything they built was better at the thing they prized most. She read this in his signature's last moments. She turned from the window and walked out of the study. Sirius was in the entrance hall when she descended. He read her face. His face did the specific thing it did, the compression of relief and grief, and something more complicated than either, the face of a man who has been waiting for news since the moment he returned from death, and heard what had happened in his absence. "Done," he said. She walked past him toward the entrance, and toward the outside air. She did not look back at the manor. She had never looked back at anything she had finished. The 6 months between the end of Voldemort and the spring equinox ritual were the longest she had experienced since the forest. Not because they were empty, they were dense with the specific labor of building institutions designed to outlast a single person's presence, which is harder than building ones that depend on one, because dependency is efficient and durability requires something more honest. She wrote constitutional law. She negotiated the Goblin Accord with Ragnarok, across 4 sessions each, one more technically complex than the last, each one more satisfying in its precision. She designed the Wizengamot's first genuine electoral framework, which required her to approach fairness as an architectural problem rather than a moral assertion, which was the kind of problem she had always been best at. She drove the Dementor Expulsion Act through the new legislative body in 6 weeks. This was considered remarkable by everyone, except Hermione, who had scheduled 6 weeks for it, because 6 weeks was the correct amount of time. George Weasley testified at the tribunal proceedings that autumn. He sat in the chamber in his Weasley's Wizard Wheezes robes. He had kept the shop open because Fred would have wanted it open, and keeping it open was the form his grief took when it was not taking the form of late nights in the flat above the shop talking to nothing, or sitting in his mother's kitchen eating food she cooked, because feeding people was what she could do. And he testified about what the regime's actions had cost his family, his friends, his customers, his community. His testimony lasted 40 minutes. He spoke without histrionics in the voice of someone who had discovered that precision was its own form of power. She watched him from the tribunal's second chair and thought that Fred would have found the whole proceeding slightly too serious for his taste and would have made Hermione's job considerably more difficult and considerably more enjoyable. After the session, George found her in the corridor. He said, "Harry's really coming back?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mum's going to need some warning. A lot of warning. Maybe a week. I'll send a message when the ritual is confirmed." He nodded. He started to leave. He stopped. Without turning, he said, "Thank you for not stopping, whatever it cost." She did not answer immediately. She said, "He would have done the same for any of us." "Yeah," George said, "he would have. That's why it matters that you did it for him." The Unspeakable team's research answers arrived 3 months early. Vera Aldridge delivered them in person, 3 binders of dense documentation filling the theoretical gaps in the Elixir of Return's construction. She handed them to Hermione with the contained excitement of a researcher delivering the most significant work of her career, and trying not to perform it. Hermione brewed the elixir herself, alone, in the Department of Mysteries Potions laboratory, over 11 days. She applied Flamel's completed methodology with the precision of 7 years of potions excellence and 4 additional years of theoretical refinement. The elixir was amber, not metaphorically amber, but the specific color of something distilled from the theoretical boundary between sustaining life and returning it. She stored it in a lead-lined vessel and did not look at it again until the equinox. The prepared vessel required the most careful work she had ever done. She constructed it across 3 weeks in the last winter before the equinox from the Flamel methodology and her own additions, and when it was complete, she placed it in the death chamber and focused entirely on the ritual's remaining structural requirements. On the night before the equinox, Sirius told 3 terrible jokes in the room of requirement. This was something he did when he was covering something. Not covering it well, but covering it because the alternative was not covering it. Hermione responded to each one with exactly the acknowledgement it deserved, which made him laugh in the way people laugh when they know they have not been fooled and are glad about it. Remus made tea. He made it with the attention that characterized everything he did, not deliberateness, which is chosen, but attention, which is constitutional. He handed her a cup and sat and was quiet. Then he said, "You know if this doesn't work, it's not your fault. You've done things that shouldn't be possible. It's going to work," she said. Sirius said, "I know, I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him in the firelight of the room of requirement and found that she had nothing to say that was sufficient, and said, "Thank you." It was the simplest thing she had said in 5 years, and it cost her nothing and everything simultaneously, and she meant it completely. At 3 in the morning she excused herself. She went to her office and sat at her desk and opened the working notebook to a blank page. She sat with the blank page for 4 hours. At 7 in the morning she wrote, 1 line, "I am afraid." She looked at it. She did not cross it out, because accuracy is the material the universe is made of, and she had been building this entire argument on accuracy, and she would not falsify the final data point. Below it she wrote, "This is not a variable. Proceed." She closed the notebook and went to the death chamber. Midnight, the night of equal dark and light. Sirius and Remus stood at the chamber's edges, positioned at the 2 anchor points the ritual's structural support required, providing their liminal state magical energy as a secondary power source. They were also witnesses. They were also, she had not said this and did not need to, the reason the ritual had warmth in it that pure calculation would not have provided. Vera Aldridge, Caius Pont, and Delia Park stood at the doorway, taking notes. Neville was against the far wall, present without interruption, as he had been for everything she had asked of him across 5 years. She stood before the archway. She turned the stone 3 times, not as mechanical activation, but as the formality that old magic responds to, the declaration of sincerity that ancient ritual had always required. She powered the stone with the Elder Wand at maximum output and felt the stone's temperature rise rapidly past body warm towards something that had no analog in her experience of heat. The veil moved. Not a 6-inch seam. A door. The tier was clean and wide, and the movement came from both sides. Because Harry had been... She had believed this. Had believed it since the equinox testing showed his soul frequency pressing against the veil's inner membrane with intent rather than drift, working toward it from the inside, while she worked from the outside. She raised the Elder Wand to her own chest. The pre-Latin words that the oldest souls had taught her, words without other living speakers, words the universe recognized as the register of an offer freely made, came to her in the full silence of the chamber, and she spoke them. She felt her magical core begin to transfer. Not painful. She had prepared for pain. What it was instead was the sensation of complete exhalation. The part of her that had been conducting magic since childhood, that had grown across 5 years into something unprecedented, moving outward along the channel toward its destination. Going. She spoke the 4th stanza, and the veil's door held, and the light came through and the stone was blazing, and the Animus Reverso crystal in her left hand went from 3 hours of ambient temperature to full resonance in a single moment. Harry was at the threshold. She knew this not from instrumentation. From variable 4, the matched frequency, the resonance entanglement that meant his presence and her calibration produced a signal she would recognize in any medium. He was there. He was aware. He had been aware for 5 years, in the way that the mathematics had always promised he would be. The last of her magical core moved through the channel. The Elder Wand went cold. The stone held its heat. From the door, light. And then, something that was not light but was adjacent to it. The presence of something that had been waiting on the other side of a very specific mathematics for a very long time, and had finally been given coordinates that resolved into a door. She administered the elixir of return to the prepared vessel with hands that were completely steady. She waited. At the first minute, color arrived, warmth, visible even without the magical sense. At the second minute, breath. A chest beginning to rise. At the third minute, eyelids moved. At the fourth minute, Harry Potter opened his eyes. He looked at the stone ceiling of the death chamber. He breathed. He took several breaths with the quality of someone relearning the sensation of air, of gravity, of having a body that belonged only to itself. He turned his head. He found her face. He said, "Hermione," not a question, not surprise. The specific quality of a person saying a name they have held in a space without language, in a frequency that is not sound, for years, and finding that the name fits the face exactly, that the mathematics was right. She was on the floor 3 feet from him. She had sat down at some point in the 4 minutes without deciding to. She looked at him with the expression she had not permitted her face in 5 years. "Hello," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was unreasonably proud of this. Behind her, at the chamber's edges, Sirius Black made a sound that was not crying, and was the thing that comes before crying and stays there, held by a man who has learned to hold things. And Remus very quietly said, "Welcome back." She did not cry immediately. The promise she had made to herself, in the forest and the dark in the first minutes of this, was kept. She had promised to wait until he was alive to see it. He was alive. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for 30 seconds, which was the time they needed to verify, with their own senses, that the covering of the distance was real. Then he said, "I was aware of you. On the other side, I couldn't. It wasn't clear, not in the way of words. But I knew you were working. I knew you hadn't stopped." "The frequency match," she said. "Variable 4, the soul bond mathematics. It operates in both directions." "The mathematics," he said. "I'll explain later," she said. "There are 11 notebooks." He almost smiled. It was the almost smile she had been doing calculations around for 5 years without admitting to herself what those calculations were. Then she cried. Harry's first hour was the ceiling of the death chamber. He looked at it with attention rather than blankness, which told her immediately that the 5 years had done something to him, had given him something that would take time to name. The enforced stillness of a place outside time, she suspected, had produced in him the specific clarity that stillness eventually gives to honest people. She gave him the hour. She sat beside him on the chamber floor and did not fill the silence with the accumulated weight of 5 years of information. The information had waited. It could wait another hour. She was also, honestly, not certain her voice would do what she needed it to do if she used it for anything complex. He spoke first. Sirius. Sirius crossed the chamber in 4 steps, and the reunion was not graceful. He grabbed Harry in both arms and said nothing for 30 seconds, which she had learned was the most complete expression available to Sirius Black of something that exceeded his vocabulary. Harry's arms came up. He held on. When Sirius released him, Remus was there. Their reunion was quieter. The quality of 2 people who shared a grief the others in the room did not access in quite the same way. The grief of the same night, the same battle, the same loss. Remus said nothing. Harry said nothing. They held each other's forearms in the old grip that meant, "You are real, I am real, we are both here." Then Harry looked at Remus's face and read something in it. "You're different," he said. "Yes," Remus said. He did not explain further. Harry filed this in the category of things to understand when he had the rest of the context. Ron arrived 3 hours later. She had sent the coin message to Neville for Ron when Harry had been breathing for 20 minutes, and Neville had reached Ron within the hour. And Ron had apparated to outside the ministry and walked in through the public entrance at a pace that suggested he had not slowed down between receiving the message and arriving. She knew from the sound in the corridor before the door opened, the specific cadence of Ron's walk, which she had been able to identify since their first year at Hogwarts without ever having studied it, the way you absorb certain information about people you love without intending to, that he was trying to walk calmly and failing. When he reached the corridor outside the death chamber, his face was doing something she recognized. The specific expression Ron wore when he had been carrying something for a long time and had reached the end of the carrying without being certain what came next. She had seen it at the end of every difficult period of their shared history. The look of a person who has been bracing against something and has just been told they can stop bracing and is still in the bracing position, checking whether the information is real. She stepped out of the chamber doorway before he reached it. He looked at her. She had not let herself think very much about what she looked like to him, what 5 years of this had done to her face, her bearing, the specific quality of her presence in a room. She saw him calculated in the way Ron calculated things, which was quickly and intuitively and with the accuracy that everyone who underestimated him on the basis of his grades had always failed to account for. "He's really in there," Ron said. "He's really in there," she said. Ron closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. "Are you all right?" This was the Ron that people who had not known him well had always missed. The one who thought to ask about her before he had even seen Harry. The one for whom the habit of including her was as constitutive as breathing. She had missed him with a specific and continuous ache across 5 years, and the ache resolved now into something else, something that did not need to be named. "I'm all right," she said, which was a more complex answer than it sounded. He nodded, in the way Ron nodded when he understood more than had been said. He looked at the chamber door. "Can I?" "Yes," she said. "Go." Harry heard him before he came through the door. She watched Harry recognize the footstep. After 5 years, through whatever remained of the frequency match he had for everyone he loved, and something in his face realigned completely, the last thing settling into place. Ron came through the door and stopped. He looked at Harry for a long moment. Then he said, "You absolute," and could not finish it, and crossed the room, and the reunion was what she knew it would be, which was the correct way. Ginny received the message from Neville through the coin. She was at Holyhead, training week, 43 other people around her, when it lit up in her pocket, and she read it in the corridor between the locker room and the pitch. She stood in that corridor for a while. The coin read, "He's back. She's done it. He's real." She sat down against the corridor wall. Her teammate Gwendolyn found her there 20 minutes later and sat down beside her without being asked, because Gwendolyn was that kind of person. And Ginny said, "Someone I lost came back," and Gwendolyn said, "Good." And they sat there together until Ginny could stand up again. She went to him the following day. Their reunion was private, as it should have been. She was 23 years old, and he had been dead since she was 17, and neither of them was the same person anymore. And what they found when they saw each other was something they had to discover by looking. It was not what it had been. It was something that had to be decided, new, which was harder and more honest than what came before. She thought about this afterward, and wrote nothing about it in any notebook. She took Harry to the 6-hour account of everything. She told it in sequence, the 63 seconds in the courtyard, and the 3 decisions. The forest, the notebooks, the stone communion. Penelope Marsh in the anima vinculum and variable 4, this without hesitation, because she was done hesitating because the person she had been hesitating in front of was now sitting across from her. Yaxley and Gringotts in the ministry, Umbridge in the tribunal, the Marauders' return, Nagini and Tom Riddle's final expression, the unspeakable team, the Flamel notes, the elixir, the constitutional framework, and the Goblin Accord, and the Dementor Expulsion Act, the 12,000 words of law she had written because she was building a world worth returning to. And the price. She stated it plainly, her magical core transferred through the channel as the offering required, gone permanently. She was 23 years old and the most influential person in British wizarding history, and she could not perform a single spell. She said this with the same voice she had used for everything else. He listened with his whole attention. He did not interrupt. He asked no questions during the telling. He received each part in full before moving to the next. When she finished, the London light outside the window had shifted from morning to afternoon. He said, "You gave up your magic. For me, yes. And you killed people. You unmade Voldemort. You built a government. You did all of this. Yes." He looked out at the London she could see from here, quieter than the London he had left, less frightened, the quality of a city that had stopped waiting for something terrible and was tentatively resuming the business of existing. "I was aware of you," he said, and this time the sentence was complete. He had had hours to find the rest of the words. "Where I was, it isn't time the way we understand it. It was more like being in a room and hearing something through the walls. A frequency, a specific frequency I recognized, always present, always working. I was never afraid. I knew you hadn't stopped." She received this. "The frequency match," she said. "Variable 4. It operates in both directions. I could find you because I was calibrated to your frequency. You could sense me because you are calibrated to mine." She paused. "I worked that out in the 2nd month in the forest. I wrote about it in the smallest handwriting I use. Why the smallest? Because it was the most important thing, and I have always been more careful with the most important things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, show me the notebooks. There are 11, she said. I know, you said. He looked at her. I'd like to read all of them. The constitutional framework was 78,000 words. Harry read all of it in 4 days. On the 5th, he came to her office at 7 in the morning with the document annotated in the margins. He had made 43 annotations. 37 were observations she had already considered, documented in appendices she expected he had not yet reached. 6 were things she had not considered. She looked at the 6 for a long time. The amnesty provision, she said. It's too narrow. He sat across from her in the chair that had become his by the territorial process of consistent occupation. You've drawn the line at documented coercion. But coercion exists on a spectrum, and drawing it at documentation means the people whose coercion was least formal, pressured socially, through the kind of fear that doesn't leave a paper trail, fall on the wrong side. She read his annotation. She read the appendix documenting her original reasoning. The enforcement problem, she said. A line that's too broad means the people who genuinely chose become indistinguishable from those who were genuinely coerced. Yes, which is why you need both, a broader amnesty and a more precise accountability mechanism. Not one line, 2 systems. She picked up her quill. She wrote, 2-system framework, amnesty, spectrum of coercion including informal social pressure, accountability, evidence weight threshold tiered by documented degree of willing participation. She looked at what she had written. That's better. It's what you would have gotten to eventually, he said. You saved me 3 weeks. He looked at her with the expression she had come to read as him being precise rather than modest. You saved me 5 years of being dead. I think the trade is favorable. The revision process took 6 weeks. They worked 14 hours a day, which was not a schedule she imposed but one that emerged from 2 people working, because 14 hours was how long the work took. Neville appeared at intervals with food, having developed across 5 years of working beside her an accurate model of when she would forget to eat. Harry learned the work with the speed of someone who had always been more capable than his circumstances allowed. The 5 years had given him something additional. He processed the constitutional framework's logic with the depth of someone for whom abstractions had become concrete, who had spent time in a place where the consequences of human choices were visible in a way they were not from inside life. He asked questions that reached the center of problems rather than their surface. He identified the gap between what a law said and what it produced in practice with the instinct of someone who had lived on the wrong side of that gap. By the end of the 6th week, the document was 81,000 words and significantly better. It was also no longer entirely hers. This was not a loss. It was what collaboration produces, something neither person could have built alone, which is superior to what either would have built separately. McGonagall accepted the headmistress position in the autumn that followed. Hermione traveled to Edinburgh to ask her. She knocked on the door of the house where McGonagall had been under modified house arrest and was admitted by a woman who had spent years watching events from a great distance, with considerably more opinions about them than she had been permitted to express. McGonagall looked at her across the sitting room. I've been reading the Regency Council's decrees. I know. The constitutional framework is excellent work. Thank you. The Muggle Studies mandate will face resistance from the existing faculty. I know, which is why I'd like you to be headmistress. A pause. Then, you brought Harry back. Yes. McGonagall looked at her for a long time, with the precision instrument quality her attention had always carried, finding exactly what was there, nothing more. You gave up your magic. Yes. And you're here asking me to be headmistress? Yes. McGonagall stood and crossed to the window and looked at Edinburgh in autumn. Then, I'll need complete academic freedom. Hogwarts governs itself under Section 11. I've read it. Yes, Hermione said. That is what Section 11 says. Then I accept. McGonagall turned. Her expression had the quality Hermione had seen across 7 years. The stern exterior and underneath it the thing that had made her a teacher in the first place. The genuine investment in what young people became. The curriculum changes will be implemented as written, and Remus Lupin's appointment stands. It was never mine to revoke, Hermione said. McGonagall almost smiled. No, I suppose it wasn't. The House Elf legislation came the following year. Harry pushed for complete recognition in the first draft. Hermione told him, during the constitutional revision sessions, that it was the correct long-term destination, and the incorrect immediate step, that a failed vote would set the precedent in the wrong direction. that a partial recognition which passed would establish the legal foundation from which complete recognition could be built. Harry disagreed. They argued for 2 days, the first genuine argument of this kind. Not operational disagreement, but a real difference about method. Both of them in possession of the same information and arriving at different conclusions about what it required. She found it clarifying in the way good arguments are clarifying. Not because either persuaded the other completely, but because making the argument forces you to identify which parts of your reasoning are structural and which are merely habitual. At the end of the second day, she said, "You're right that the partial recognition is a compromise, and you're right that compromises made for strategic rather than principled reasons are corrosive. Those two things are both true," he said. "So what do we do with two true things that point in different directions?" She thought about it. "We build in a mandatory review mechanism. The partial recognition passes. The legislation requires a full statutory review within 5 years. Automatic, non-deferrable. In 5 years, the Wizengamot has to vote again, and by then we'll have 5 years of precedent demonstrating that partial recognition caused no harm and every reason to extend it." He considered this. "That's not a compromise. That's a timeline." "Yes," she said. "I prefer timelines to compromises." The legislation passed. The review occurred in its 5th year. Full recognition passed on the first vote. Sirius, in the years that followed, was a man who had decided what to do with being not quite dead. He ran intelligence, had always run it even in Azkaban, through the specific calculus of memory and attention that kept a mind functional under sustained assault. The network he and Remus built was the most effective in British magical history, and its effectiveness was a function of Sirius's particular combination. Brilliance presenting as recklessness, charm concealing precision, social fluency making people tell him things they would not tell someone who appeared to be paying attention. He also rode his motorbike through Muggle London on Tuesday evenings, because he had been meaning to do this for 26 years, and had decided that liminal state limitations were not going to prevent him. The modification required 6 hours of collaborative engineering between Sirius and the 3 Unspeakables, who approached the problem with the focused enthusiasm of people encountering something they had never previously had occasion to try. Caius Pont considered it their finest applied work product. Sirius considered it adequate. Sirius, in the years that followed, had the quality of a man who had decided, deliberately and with great care, what to do with being not quite dead. He ran intelligence, had always run it, even in Azkaban in the way that Azkaban allowed, through the specific calculus of memory and attention that keeps a mind functional under sustained assault. He knew which second-tier Death Eaters were privately disenchanted. He knew which Ministry employees had been there only because they had no alternative. He knew, from the network he and Remus built across the years after their return, the exact internal temperature of every political faction in British wizarding society, and several abroad. He used this knowledge with a precision that looked like effortlessness from the outside, which was how Sirius Black had always done everything that required significant effort. He also rode his motorbike through Muggle London on Tuesday evenings. The modification, calibrated for liminal state operation by 6 hours of collaborative engineering between Sirius and the 3 Unspeakables, had been Caius Pont's proudest applied work product, and Sirius's most enthusiastically used operational liberty. He would return from these rides with the specific quality of someone who had remembered something they had been meaning to remember, and he was better at everything afterward. Remus taught defense against the dark arts. He was the best teacher the subject had ever had. The evaluations, the student feedback, the curriculum reviews, all confirmed it without exception. His students understood what they were defending against, in a way that changed what they were capable of becoming. He published 3 books. They were required reading in 6 countries. He ran the intelligence network's deep tier, the part that required patience and precision, and the capacity to maintain relationships over long periods with people who needed to trust before they shared anything. Which was, Hermione had always thought, simply Remus doing what Remus had always done, except now on a systematic scale. He had not yet chosen to pass on fully. Hermione had not asked him about this. It was not her question to ask. He had spent 36 years existing in a different position in the topography of existence, and knew more about making that habitable than she could calculate. He would go when he was ready. He would know when that was. Harry told her once that he understood it. She said she thought so too. They did not discuss it further, because some things are more honoring left in the category of understood than forced into the category of analyzed. In the years of rebuilding, Harry was present in the way he had always been present, the quiet, unremarked physical presence that prevented manageable difficulties from becoming unmanageable ones. The specific political authority of someone who had been in the place that was past this world and had come back and was here, doing the work, with no remaining requirement to prove anything to anyone. Kingsley told her once that Harry's speech to the first Wizengamot session was the finest oratory he had witnessed in 40 years of public service. She told Kingsley she agreed. She watched it from the back of the gallery with her hands folded, and the feeling of someone watching an argument they believed in be made by the person best positioned to make it, which was the feeling she had always associated with justice working correctly. By the third year after Harry's return, she was teaching, not at Hogwarts. She had declined Kingsley's suggestion of the headmistress position, and meant it. What she had built in the years of the Regency was a curriculum without institutional walls, a program in magical theory distributed through the Regency's educational publishing arm, designed for the practitioners who had always found the standard education's relationship with theory to be superficial. She designed it on the principle that the most important thing education could produce was not knowledge, but the capacity to generate knowledge, the specific skill of knowing how to find out what you did not yet know. She taught without a wand. She explained the mathematics of a Patronus charm, the resonance conditions that produced corporeal form, the arithmetic basis for why emotional state functioned as a power source, with the clarity of someone for whom the working of it was entirely visible, even if the working of it was no longer accessible. She explained memory charm theory. She explained the deep mechanics of the unforgivable curses, which could only be understood by someone who understood the relationship between will and magical effect at the level she had developed, and which needed to be understood if they were to be defended against. Harry sat in on the sessions sometimes. He listened to her explain the soul frequency mathematics and the resonance principles, and the specific mechanics of what she had done in the death chamber. And afterward, he said that the explanation was better than any he had been given, including the one she had given him about Patronuses in the Room of Requirement when he was 13. That explanation was produced under time pressure, she said. And this one, she said, I've had years to think about. Vera Aldridge began attending the advanced sessions in the second year of the program, initially to verify the accuracy of the soul frequency content, and subsequently because she had discovered that Hermione's synthesis of arithmancy and veil research produced implications for her own work that she had not previously considered. Caius Pont came for the same reason several months later. Delia Park had been attending since the first session, quietly taking notes. By the fifth year, the program had more applicants than Hermione could directly teach, which required her to do something she had never done before: train other teachers. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this was the part of the work she was best at, not the transmission of information, which anyone could do, but the identification in a student of how their mind worked and the specific calibration of explanations to that particular architecture. Harry told her this was because she had always done it, without the label, for everyone she had ever helped. She told him that was an overstatement. He told her to read the 11 notebooks and reconsider. She did not reread all 11 notebooks. She read the sections he was referring to. She concluded he was approximately 70% correct, which was the kind of partial accuracy she considered sufficient for an argument to be worth having again. Ron joined the Aurora program in the years that followed and proved, as she had always suspected he would, that he was considerably better at operational thinking than he had ever been given credit for. His first year of training, he was top of his cohort. He told her this in a letter that mentioned it once and moved on, which was exactly how Ron communicated things he was proud of. And she wrote back at length about the constitutional amendment she was working on, and mentioned at the end that she was proud of him, which was exactly how she communicated the same thing. George kept the shop open. He expanded it, eventually, a second location in Hogsmeade, a third in Edinburgh. A range of products he developed with the specific brilliance that had always been part of what the twins were together, and turned out to be also part of what George was alone, differently arranged, but not diminished. Fred's name was on the sign. It always had been. It always would be. Some things are permanent, not because they resist change, but because change cannot reach them. Platform 9 3/4 on the 1st of September is controlled chaos in the specific way of a place that has been controlled chaos on this date for over a century, and has developed, through long practice, a kind of organic order within it. Families, trunks, owls, the Scarlet Engine, the specific emotional climate of children who are excited in a way that presents as irritability, and parents who are sad in a way that presents as logistics management. Hermione was arguing about a book. She had lent a first edition of Arithmancy and Soul Theory, a unified framework, her own required reading in 11 countries, to Neville's eldest in July. It had not come back. She was explaining to Neville's daughter, who was returning for her 6th year, that the book needed to return before October because a student in the advanced theoretical program needed it. Neville's daughter was explaining that she had been lending it to half her year group because it explained memory charm mathematics better than the standard text. Which is gratifying, Hermione said, but not a solution to the problem. The book can stay until winter break. Tell whoever has it that there's a typographical error in the third equation on page 214. The correct exponent is 4, not 3. I've been meaning to issue the correction for a year. I'll tell them, Neville's daughter said, took her trunk, and disappeared into the crowd. Neville, standing nearby, said, "She's been telling people the book changed how she thinks about magic." "The equation error is in there regardless," Hermione said. "The rest of it isn't," he said. She did not argue with this. She picked up her bag and moved toward the platform's edge, where Harry was managing their youngest's trunk, doing it without being asked, the way he always did things without being asked, the specific, unremarked physical presence that had characterized him since before she had the language for what it meant. The platform had everyone on it. Sirius was at the far end in his best robes, talking to Kingsley with the animation of someone who has spent years developing a theory about ministry budget allocation and has found a willing audience. He greeted Harry by grabbing his arm in the old grip. He greeted Hermione with the look, the specific look he had been giving her for years now, which contained more than a look could technically hold. He said, to neither of them, "Fred would have loved this." George, nearby, put his hand in the pocket where he kept the small object he always carried, a Weasley's Wizard Wheezes novelty from the year before the battle, kept in working order all these years, and said nothing. This was sufficient. George had learned, in the long years since, to carry his brother in the way that did not require anyone else to carry him carrying it. He had learned to laugh again without qualifying the laugh. He had learned that Fred would have been furious if he had done otherwise, and that honoring someone did not always mean being sad. Neville was nearby, managing his children's luggage with the cheerful competence of someone who has long since made peace with the gap between how organized he intended to be and how organized he actually was. He caught Hermione's eye across the platform and raised a hand in greeting, the specific greeting of two people who have done significant things together, and understand that this particular moment does not require acknowledgement of that because the moment is its own thing, and that history is already established. She raised a hand back. This was enough. Ron was there with his family, doing the thing he did best on this platform, which was being loudly helpful and slightly chaotic in the way of someone who understood intuitively that arrival and departure required energy directed outward rather than inward. His children were emphatically his children, which was visible in their faces and their volume. He was a senior auror now, with a reputation for field judgment that had surprised his superiors and nobody who had known him since he was 11. He had sent her a brief note when he received his first commendation, which said, "Hermione, got a thing. Have you had lunch?" She had replied, "Congratulations, yes." She had meant both. Remus arrived quietly, which was how Remus always arrived. He looked at the platform, at the train, at the families and the chaos and the steam. He looked at Harry and then at Hermione, in the sequence that meant he was performing his annual calculation, the before and after, the measured distance between where they had been and where they were. He had never told her what it produced. She suspected she knew. Ginny was at the far end of the platform with her children, talking to someone Hermione recognized as a former Holyhead teammate. She was 38 years old, and carried herself with the specific authority of someone who had built their life on their own terms after everything had been taken from them, and had built it well. She and Harry shared custody of their children across separate households. This had taken time to arrive at, and had been arrived at with the honesty that both of them had earned across years of separate becoming. They were better parents apart than they could have been together, which was not a failure but a specific kind of success that required more courage than many more obvious kinds. Their youngest waved from the window. Harry lifted his hand. The wave was not something she had to calculate. It was just a man waving at his child going somewhere safe. She watched it anyway with the full attention she brought to things she chose to remember. The train moved. She watched it move until it was gone. 19 years. The world it entered was not the world she had grown up in. Not perfect. She had never claimed perfection as a standard. The Wizengamot had made decisions she disagreed with. The Goblin Accord had required 2 rounds of renegotiation. The House Elf recognition had implementation failures and 3 regions being addressed by the review mechanism she had built. None of this disappointed her. She had designed the framework to be improved by people with better information than she had, which was the most honest thing she had ever built into a document. The world was measurably, verifiably better than the world that had existed on the night the last battle was fought. She had documented this in the later volumes of the working notebooks, the before and after, the specific deltas, the measured change. She had read it once and would not read it again, because the data was in her memory, and the data had always been in her memory. She did not feel her magical core when September came. She had not felt it in many years. She had been asked about this by researchers, journalists, the occasional student who had worked up the courage, in various ways across the years since the ritual, whether she missed it, whether the loss was present, whether the trade was worth it. She answered honestly. The loss was present in the way that an absence is present. She was aware of the shape of the space, the way you are aware of a room cleared of furniture. You know exactly where everything was, the specific dimensions of what is gone. She could feel magic around her. The passive sense, which had not been part of her magical core but an outgrowth of the ancient sorcery she had developed, persisted. She could read every magical signature in range. She could feel the specific frequency of Harry's magic the way she had been feeling it since the soul frequency mathematics first identified it as matched to her own. She simply could not conduct it, could not channel it through her own body. What she could do was understand it completely, at every level of its operation. She was 43 years old. She was the most influential witch in living memory. She had not cast a spell in 19 years. She had never once reconsidered the trade. Harry said, "Do you regret any of it?" She considered the question seriously. This was always her first response, the genuine engagement with what was being asked, the refusal to answer from the surface rather than the substance. "I regret that the situation existed that required it," she said. "I regret every person who died before I could do something about it. I don't regret what I did, because it was what needed doing, and I was the person who could do it." She looked at him. "Do you?" He was quiet for the amount of time that genuine thinking required, which was longer than performance and shorter than uncertainty. He had the answer. He was finding the words that fit it. "No," he said. "You brought me back. I can't regret anything that happened because all of it is why you brought me back." She looked at the place where the train had disappeared. "The Goblin Accord Amendment," she said, after a moment, "is going up for final vote next week." "It's going to pass," he said. "I spoke to Ragnarok on Thursday." She looked at him. "When? While you were writing the presentation, I asked him not to tell you. I wanted it to be—" He found the word. "A contribution." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know what Ragnarok told me when I first went to Gringotts? He said Gringotts had been waiting for someone with the intelligence to understand their grievances. And I think you would have done all of it if I hadn't." He considered this. She watched him examine it with the full attention of someone who did not accept propositions without testing them. "No," he said, "I wouldn't. I would have tried something different, and it would have been faster and less thorough, and it would have left gaps." He looked at her. "You don't leave gaps." "I left variable 8, uncalculated for 5 years, she said. "That's not a gap," he said. "That's a variable you were correctly patient with." She considered this. She put it in the notebook, not the volume she currently worked in, but the older one, the one she had started in the forest on the night the last battle ended. The one with problem, "Harry Potter is dead," written at the top of the first working page. She had been adding to it sporadically across the years, in the margins of other entries, the accumulated record of what the conclusion had produced. She wrote, "Variable 8 resolved, not a gap. Correctly patient." She closed the notebook. She was aware, in the specific way she was always aware of things she chose to be aware of, that the platform around her contained nearly every person who had made what followed possible. Sirius, who had returned from the edge of death and given her the operational structure she needed. Remus, who had rebuilt the intelligence architecture that made the regime's end achievable. Neville, who had run the network for years from inside a hostile institution and had done it without complaint, without glory, without anyone calling it what it was, which was extraordinary. Ron, who had trusted the network and kept working inside it and had shown up, on the day it mattered most, at the exact speed his footstep had always conveyed. George, who had kept a sign lit above a shop window in Diagon Alley, through 3 years of regime, and proved that some things were too stubborn to be extinguished. Kingsley, who had rebuilt a ministry worth the name. Vera Aldridge and Caius Pont, and Delia Park, who had answered questions they had spent a decade half-asking, and had done it 3 months ahead of schedule. McGonagall, who was not on this platform because she had marking to do, and was not the kind of person who attended events she had not been specifically required to attend, but who was somewhere in a Hogwarts office right now with her window open and the September light coming through it the right way. All of these people, all of this work, and at the center of it, as always, the mathematics, the argument that had begun on a fresh page in a dark forest and ended, again and again, at the same conclusion. Harry Potter is alive. The solution worked. The timeline was finite. Begin. And then, all of this. Sirius appeared beside them from wherever the conversation with Kingsley had ended up, claiming he was going to the Leaky Cauldron and extending the invitation as a courtesy. Ron said yes immediately. George said yes in the tone of a man who had been waiting for the invitation. Neville said he'd come for 1 hour, which meant 2. Remus said he had marking, which was true, and said it without apology, which was also true. Harry looked at Hermione. She looked back. She picked up her bag and put it over her shoulder and extended her hand. He took it with the ease of someone who has been doing this for 19 years and finds it still the most natural available action. They walked back through the barrier together, into the ordinary September morning of a world that was not finished being built, but was further along than anyone had had reason to expect. On a night in early spring, many years ago, when a 19-year-old girl had sat down in the dark between 2 oak trees and written at the top of a fresh page, "Problem: Harry Potter is dead. Solution required. Timeline: unspecified but finite. Begin." She had begun. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.